Hi, everybody, it's Lee Caraher, and this is Everything Speaks, where we talk about how everything you do and say speaks for you if you want it to or not. We're going to take a page out of my PR Stratcom world at Double Forte, and I'm going to talk about how different news sources are now entering the fray, have entered the fray, are changing the landscape, and how we need to think about, everybody needs to think about where they get their information, how is it vetted, how do you reach those people who are news sources, information sources, and from a media relations awareness driving information point of view, what does the landscape look like today? So I'm going to show this to you here. There we go. Our POV drops why Americans are turning to alternative news sources and what does that mean? First, I think it's no surprise to anybody who listens to this podcast or follows Double Forte, Americans' perceptions of mainstream media outlets, which, really used to enjoy such high regard across the board as accurate, unbiased, trustworthy sources of information has, declined precipitously. Well, in my career, for sure, during the time of Double Forte and really in the last 10 to 12 years. According to Gallup, 32% of Americans expressed having little confidence in mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly, compared to 31% who reported having a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media. In the 1970s, as reference, that number on confidence was 68 to 72%. And then by the 1990s, that had plummeted to 51%. And now we're down to 33%. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Cable news really drove a wedge through media as we know it, created lots and lots of opportunities, but it also created opportunities where news doesn't have to be news. You can say your news when you're not, the FCC definition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So with the left and the right and being able to find your different audiences with very specificity online, in cable, on YouTube, the whole thing, it's not surprising that we don't trust this category called mainstream media. My husband, who calls our representative often, was told by our congressperson that don't believe the media. Oh, okay. That was a good day. Anyway, so if we think about the people who are delivering news, so many of us get news from TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or YouTube or podcasts or whatever, right? There's so many more ways for people to consume news and information. There's actually more people covering the news than there were before, or covering the media, because it's a category on its own. So it's important for us as PR, media relations, marketing people to have a pulse on what's going on in media, but also understand how news is disseminating and who has that influence and how do you trust what you're reading, what you're seeing, what you're viewing. So first, the rise of the columnist. So the columnist op-ed page used to be a page, opinion editorial, in a newspaper. Have you seen those before? Just one page. And we knew that it was a columnist and it had an opinion and could be biased, could be skewed, etc. And the goal of traditional news media, by the definition of FCC, over the air, free airwaves, was you had to have both sides of an issue to talk about something. But with cable, you didn't have to do that because FCC was not granting you access to those free airwaves, and you could have singular points of view. I was on the board of KQED San Francisco, which is the San Francisco-based largest public media organization in the country for radio and television together. Now I'm on the board of Friends of Public PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin-based PBS organization that obviously does a lot of news. And those organizations, as public media funded by people, have to be free, have to be available over the air and also through other means. They work so hard to make sure, I can tell you this from my time with them, they work so hard to make sure that it's fact-based and then opinions on both sides. And really, for my time at KQED, we knew we were on track when we got as many complaints from the left as we did from the right, etc. So that's traditional media. Obviously got upended by cable first, and then the internet, then Twitter, then YouTube, and now all the other streams. The other piece of this, too, is the generational shifts, right? So we have our Gen Z born 97 to 2012. They came of age surrounded by, they're totally digital natives. And they came out of the womb with the phone in their hands, right? And they don't consume news the way my generation, and I'm the cusp of Boomer and Xers, do. In 2023, Pew Research survey says that 1/3 of adults under 30 regularly scroll TikTok for news. That's their specific purpose of going on. What's going on, which was up 255% from 2020. And one of the things that came to light was that they stated a preference for reporting that feels relatable and a personal compared to mass media. So I'm seeing myself in somebody I'm trusting while I scroll, and then sort of the interconnection of TikTokers, reposting and getting news from each other, etc. It's also interesting to note that nearly 40% of Gen Z report they trust social media influencers, which is 9% higher than the overall number of media that Americans trust mainstream media. Ouch. Man, that's brutal. It's brutal. And who are these people? I mean, you have to dig down to see if these, are they being reposted there? I have a friend, Jonathan Poratz, who used to be at Double Forte. He was at Double Forte for 10 years, and he is awesome on Facebook. He keeps us all on our toes. Like, did you look at that before you reposted it? Do you know that that's true or not? Let me do Snopes for you. He's my personal Snopes, frankly, because we're responsible for what we share. And it makes it harder if we trust our social media sources, but we don't know if they have the same research and standards that traditional media should have. Question is if they do or not, right? Etc. So that's how misinformation spreads so fast, is that we have a social media influencer. We like that person. We trust that person. We repost, and it was factually incorrect. It's really hard to take it back. Really, really hard to take it back. So almost 40% of U.S. adults under 30 get their news from influencers. And among Americans who get that 40%, 65% say that news influencers help them better understand current events and civic issues. And, one person who has risen tremendously in terms of her cachet and respect as a news source is Under the Desk News on TikTok. She's also on YouTube now. And she is a political reporter from a more progressive point of view, but she goes on every single day, every single night. Here's what happened today. It's Under the Desk News on TikTok and on YouTube. And her account was responsible for really, they've done the data on this. They tested this, responsible for getting more young people signed up to be voters than other news sources in the last election cycle. So obviously very important. When we think about the alternatives to traditional media, mainstream media, so mainstream media, the big, ABC, NBC, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, your neighbor, your local newspaper, if you still have one, that kind of stuff. They were spending more time on our smartphones than in paper or on television, right? I actually don't. My TV's through YouTube TV, so I don't get the same things that other people get if they're doing OTA or doing cable or a satellite TV, right? So if 54% of the United States population, 54%, over half, get their news from social media, and 1/3 of those people are getting it from Facebook and YouTube are their primary sources of news. Gen Z and millennials strongly favor TikTok as their go-to channels. And then, of course, we have LinkedIn, which is a huge source of more business-related news, market-related news. And LinkedIn has, a very large editorial staff. They're doing their own news. They have a news staff. And then most traditional media and social media are using LinkedIn as a channel, as a platform to publish their news as well. So you'll see on LinkedIn, what's being watched on the right-hand side, and then depending on what's in your feed. But LinkedIn is a huge source of reliable media in the business sense. And X, with Twitter X, even though the popularity is down, most reporters are on X regardless because of the fast movingness of it. Although, there's, something like only 6% of people on X generate 90% of the content on X, something like that. It's a little crazy. But then also there's Truth Social, and then there's Blue Sky. I mean, there's just so many things. But 54%, let's show you the graphic, 54% are getting their news from all these different sources. To keep in touch, you got to do it all, right? You got to look at the news. You got to look at all of your sources. Otherwise, how are you going to know? Podcasts are, and you're listening to this one, right? Podcasts, 47% of Americans 12 or older are listening to podcasts at least once a month, up from 41% in 2021. And it's just exploding. It's exploding as a platform. We recommend it all the time. It's a lot of work to do, but if you can be a podcaster and it gives you a really efficient way to drive a lot of content, to do it well, to make it past 10 episodes, most podcasts start and then they stop after 10 episodes because it's a lot of work, but it's still becoming more and more popular. Most of the news, every morning I listen to the podcast from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, NPR, and then a whole slew of other things. So Peter Zion, Scott Galloway on Prof G Marketplace or whatever it is. And then I have my other ones, right, which are, the Freakonomics and The Rest is History, one of my favorite podcasts of all time. And then there's all the other podcasts. So I'm also into Premier League soccer and U.S. soccer. So I'm listening to Men in Blazers. I mean, I'm getting so much news from the podcasts, both from not traditional media, NPR, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times, and new media, podcasters. So Freakonomics, Men in Blazers, and then The Rest is History, etc. And Prof G, not reporters, right? Thought leaders. You know how much I hate that word. So almost all mainstream media have podcasts or taking their streams and they're putting it into podcast form or creating specific podcasts on different topics. There's so many different podcasts you can get from NPR, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And then so many reporters have lost their jobs and then they've reached it on their own. So think Don Lemon, think Joy Reid. They lost their jobs. And so they started their own news world with a podcast and a Substack, which is a blog newsletter. Kara Swisher, who used to be a writer at Wall Street Journal, now she's got On with Kara Swisher. She's also on Pivot with Scott Galloway. And that's their primary distribution. So if we're not thinking about podcasts as a way to reach people, we're not doing well. We're not going to reach all the people we need to reach. The independent news sites, so ProPublica, Straight Arrow News, The Intercept, Substack. So also super important. Substack is where so many journalists have gone, set up their podcast. They set up this newsletter on Substack or Patreon. Those can have free versions and paid versions. And in Axios, the number of Substack journalists in news and politics making more than $1 million has doubled in the last year. 22 newsletters have tens of thousands of paid subscribers. So these journalists who were on salary are now, if they find their niche and they do their job, are doing $1 million in income, where maybe they were on salary for 150, maybe they're on salary for 200 max. And then you could think about ProPublica and Straight Arrow News and The Intercept as alternative media, but they are more, the people who work for those organizations are on salary for much less dollars than, but they have a different platform, right? Substack is your own platform, your own newsletter. You're doing all the work yourself to make that happen. The other thing, what's going on, you think about Reddit, Discord, Telegram, Twitch, huge. Reddit, in particular, a huge source of information and group information, sort of. If you think about community spaces, they're so popular. They're old. Frankly, in the world, they're not long in the tooth, but they're not like Johnny-come-latelys. But they remain popular and they have consistently high engagement. from users. And Reddit is now preventing or trying to prevent LLMs from scraping its site for training and for information because of the value of the news that's happening on Reddit. It's almost 20 years old, right? It's almost 20 years old. What's interesting about Reddit is that, so it was 20 years old. If I was on Reddit, which I was 20 years ago, but the age on Reddit has stayed pretty stagnant. So it keeps getting bigger by having younger people join it, which is very unusual in today's media landscape. 51% of Gen Z favor Reddit's user-driven nature, and 87% said they love being part of the Reddit community. Those are huge numbers on this. You can read the report on Twitch and Discord and Telegram. There's just more and more there. So when we think about trying to end media relations, like who do you need to talk to? Who are those people who are reaching your audience? You need to think the whole gambit. What are the traditional media? How are they distributing their news now? They're distributing it in their regular form. So if it's television, then on a podcast and in social media, on LinkedIn, on whatever, all the different places. Maybe it's a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal who now has their own Substack and a podcast. Or maybe it's a person like Dory Clark, who is expert on entrepreneurship and personal branding. She has books, and a newsletter, as well as she publishes regularly for the HBR. And she's a professor. And then instead of having her own podcast, she's a guest on lots and lots and lots of podcasts. So she has tremendous influence, not through her own podcast, but being a guest on podcasts. So where do you need to be? Everywhere. And you need to do a better job. We all need to do better jobs of fact checking all these people. We have a team Double Forte that just vets influencers. You're making sure that they are who they say they are, that they have credible platforms, that the people who follow them are credible, inflammatory, because where we reach out for on behalf of our clients, where we want our clients to be so that they can reach their audiences, so it's relevant. We've talked about relevance before. We want to match up where the client is with what the audience is. And those platforms really matter, right? The quality of the platform really matters. Where you are says a lot about who you are, meaning where your news is carried says a lot about who you are, depending on who that audience is. So media landscape is still in flux. It always seems to be, I started this company before Twitter, so the thing we do has stayed the same for 20-something years, but how we do it changes all the time. And the discipline we now need to put around, one, identifying those people who reach the audiences we want to reach, number one. Number two, identifying and verifying the veracity of those people and the trustworthiness of those people in terms of carrying a true factual message couldn't be more important, and it's become more a different part of our world. But you got to know the key platforms and you got to know the key players and where do they show up and how do they show up. And the mainstream media, it still matters. So don't giving up on it. If you're listening to podcasts, you would hear them quoting the mainstream media all the time. And there's a reason for that. There's absolutely a reason for that. So at the same time, there's never been a place where now you can create your own content, become your own news source. Highly recommend. It's going to be more and more important to be your own news source, because then you'll have the breadcrumbs of truth, the breadcrumbs of facts that you can be found for stories and for people talking about you, which of course is the point. Keeping your audience top of mind. Who are they? Where are they? How do they consume? What do they trust? What don't they trust? And making sure that you line up your relevance with that. All right. So I highly recommend that you go over to doubleforte.com. You can also find the link in the show notes for this podcast, and easy download why Americans are turning to alternative news sources and what to do about it. And until next time, I'm Lee Caraher, and this is Everything Speaks.